All right, hello and welcome everyone to another Chat and Learn here with Power to Fly. My name is Mariella Marie, and as always, super excited to roll into this next hour with you all. We got a lot of folks joining us, a lot of folks already turning their cameras on. I see you, I appreciate you, and I don't want to take too much time to go over the introduction. A lot of you have joined these Chat and Learns before, but I do want to take some time to go over some housekeeping rules that are more like guidelines so we can make sure we're respecting everyone's voices and we're really being intentional about this hour. So I like to start us off by reminding us, even though we don't need reminders, that the world is on fire. Seems like everything is topsy-turvy. You could be doing anything else with your time right now, but you're deciding to be with us for the hour. So let's participate. Let's really be intentional about this hour. We have a phenomenal person here that is ready to drop knowledge, share wisdom, so take notes, turn your cameras on if you feel called to do so. That's one way you can participate. You can also participate by hopping off of mute whenever you have something you want to say. Again, we would love to just speak at you for the hour, but we really want you to participate. So you have our permission to hop off mute whenever you have a reflection you want to share, a dream that you want to share, any tips and tricks of your own. But I just ask that we all be respectful and have one person off of mute at a time. I'm not afraid to kick people off of the session. This is a safe virtual space, and I need to make sure that everyone is being heard. So if you do hop off mute, you will be featured in our live recording as this is being recorded. And so I know that we are the kings and queens of multitasking central these days, but I ask for you to close your tabs, stop multitasking, get a pen and paper if you like, old school, so that you can really be present and hop off mute or drop things in the chat box when they come to mind. Then you can rewatch this video later on Power to Fly, and you can take notes vigorously there. You can open up all the tabs you want, have coffee, dance around, all those things. But I do ask for your presence so that we can participate in this 1 hour session. If anyone has any sensitive information and you prefer to be kept anonymous, feel free to write me in the chat box privately. You can find me under Mariella Marie. You can write to me privately there, and I'll flag your question or your reflection to our guest speaker. And the last thing that I'll say is we'd love for you to follow us on socials and subscribe to our YouTube channel so you can keep up with all the great chats we've got in store for you here at Power to Fly. So if this is your first time joining a Chat and Learn where I've moderated before, just want to take a couple of seconds to introduce myself. Again, my name is Mariella Marie, originally from Los Angeles, California. I currently live in Patagonia, Argentina. I'm trying to make some big moves out here. I love to speak about the importance of emotional intelligence in the workplace, at home, and at play. So I might bring some of my reflections to that note. If anyone wants to philosophize with me there, feel free. And I would love to invite you to support the project that I'm working on that is called the Positive Force Team. You can go to thepositiveforceteam.org. You can sign up for our newsletter there, or I'm happy to connect on LinkedIn. All right, so without further ado, I'm going to pass the mic to our guest speaker, Dr. Van Bailey. Let us know a little bit about yourself, how you came to learn about Power to Fly, and what you're excited to share with us today.
Absolutely. So my name is Dr. Van Bailey. I use he, him, his, and they, them, theirs pronouns. I am an educator, storyteller, fashion curator. My main kind of 9-to-5 work is in higher education, directly working with faculty, staff, and students around bias incident support. So what that basically means is just coming from a trauma-informed lens, particularly when bias and hate happens on campus, and how do we go about reducing or helping to address the harm that has happened. I've been in higher education, I need to update that, about 15 years now. And, much of my work is really in regards to how do we be our full and authentic selves in the workplace, while also having the very real conversation about what harm comes to folks who identify as LGBTQ in the workplace. I'm currently back in school getting my master's degree in social work because I have a deep love and appreciation for the work that happens on the ground when it comes to particularly employees who experience trauma as it relates to the workplace. And this came from my direct experience working in cultural centers and just working with staff members who were burnt out, leaving the field, and just overall just feeling kind of the brunt of not only supporting historically marginalized people as a result of their jobs, but being in that position themselves, and being in institutions that necessarily didn't support them. I came to know Power to Fly through my very good friend, E.C. Pizarro III. He's a phenomenal brand and marketing just guru. So for folks, he's currently on the call, I believe. Y'all should definitely check out his work. Phenomenal person. And so, got directly connected to the work that you all are doing, and just really appreciative and wanted to connect and provide any expertise that I can come from the lens that I have.
Beautiful. And I had the pleasure and honor of interviewing EC in June. So I'm happy that he's here as well. And of course, if we have that, what is it? It's not 6 degrees of separation now. We are directly connected.
It's one. Right?
Yeah, it's 1 degree. So thank you, EC. Thank you, Dr. Bailey, for being here. And I would actually, before we roll into these awesome questions that folks have submitted offline, I would love for you to cover the principal themes for today's conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. So some principal themes for today is, one, how to bring your true self to work and what to expect from it. Tips on maintaining and embracing your identity in the workplace. What are some strategies for self-care and sustainability practices at work? And then how can companies support their employees, particularly those who identify as LGBTQ+ in the workplace?
Beautiful. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and I'm going to pull up these awesome questions that you all have submitted previous to the conversation. So if you hear your question come up, let us know that you're here with us today. Just drop that in the chat box. And if you don't hear your question come up and you have one that comes to mind in the moment, drop that in the chat box. I'm going to sound like a broken record throughout the hour because we want to hear from you. So again, feel free to hop off mute or write in the chat box. And I just want to highlight and shout out some folks who are already using the chat box, letting us know where they're calling from. So our guest speaker is calling from Maryland outside of DC. I'm calling from Patagonia. We've got Las Vegas representing, Oakland. We've got San Francisco, Hollywood, Florida, Seattle, Washington, DC, Oakland, California, Philly, Detroit, Buenos Aires, Washington, DC again. We've got Atlanta, normally in Nebraska, but working in Atlanta today. We got Dallas, Austin, Texas, Denver, Colorado. Great. So continue using the chat box. We want to hear from you. And if you are just joining us, I did give an official invitation in the beginning to turn your cameras on if you feel called to do so. We believe in visibility here at Power to Fly. This is a safe space. So again, if your house is a mess, put your virtual backgrounds on or show your mess. Show up as you are. We respect you. We are not judging. We just want to hear from you today. So let's roll right into these questions that you all have submitted. And this is a great kickoff just to set the stage for this conversation. So Van, let us know, how do you best describe the concept of identity?
Yeah, I saw that question and I was like, what? Identity is really about the self, right? How does one situate themselves in a larger context of culture, in the larger context of being in community. And so, it's really around when you look in the mirror, what are the different aspects that are reflected back to you, and how does that align with your true self? And so that's, how I would describe identity broadly.
Alignment. That is a major theme in my life recently, and I would say just in general. And I think that we're always coming into alignment. At least I hope that we are going with the flow of alignment. And that appears in so many ways. And I love this visual of looking in the mirror and seeing what is reflected back. How can we realign or adjust accordingly and not be afraid, to shed some skin, reinvent ourselves, especially now. We need more of that happening. Otherwise, we're falling back on a default. We're trying to go back to a new normal, which is like, that makes it makes me go crazy when I hear people say that. It's like, that wasn't working. We cannot go back to any kind of normality. So I think this idea of alignment as helping understand your identity will help reshape a non-normal that we can move
Yeah.
into in the future.
Yeah, for sure. And it's not fixed, right? So, we're talking about identity in terms of right here, right now, right? Identity shifts, it can shift, it should shift. And so to know that it is an ever evolving thing. And so definitely and I'm going to speak a lot about myself and my own experiences. The identity that I had, in 2005, it's definitely not the identity and understanding that I have right now in 2021, right? So just to know that it's ever evolving.
As we are evolving, we live in an ecosystem that is very adaptable. And so when I look at just how rigid we are and how just like left brain thinking we are, we're denying another part of ourselves that allows us to be more fluid. So thank you for highlighting that.
Yeah.
All right, this next question here. How can we avoid being stereotyped?
Yeah, I saw this question and I'm going to approach it from kind of the sociological perspective in terms of saying you can't. Because stereotyping is not necessarily something that is on you to own. It's typically on others, right? And this is around socialization. And we have all been socialized, depending upon where you are in the world, around different cultural aspects when it comes to identity. And how we are socialized and in result in how we might be liberated from that socialization is all dependent upon our environment, how we grew up, things like that. So bias is like identity is kind of a natural aspect of who we are, and bias is related to stereotyping. And so stereotypes don't necessarily go away, right? This is a human condition. But I think that there are different ways in which we can check our own biases and check our own ways in which we might be stereotyping people, which is, kind of our own self-work to do. But to get into the exhausting work of trying not to be stereotyped is emotional labor that I wouldn't ask people to engage in, right? Especially as we're talking about being authentic and being ourselves.
And how can we check those biases? Especially, my big right now, because I speak with a lot of technologists or a lot of people who work in the tech field. And there was one interview that really stuck out for me. I interviewed a woman in Kenya who really brought to light the fact that artificial intelligence is actually discriminatory. And my question is why? Well, who's building most of the tech, and have they really been checked, or are they checking themselves on their biases? So if someone is listening right now, not to say we only need to focus on people who are working in the tech industry, but just because it has such, this very powerful global reach, that's something that I love to speak about. How can we make sure we're not bringing those into things that we're creating and sharing with the world? I know that's a really tough question, but
it is.
What do you recommend?
Yeah. What I would recommend, and the conversations that I like to have with people, particularly around bias, because this is, the full-time work that I do, is oftentimes, when you're talking about this AI, right? People are building them, right? And so people are flawed. People are oftentimes coming from the context in which they've been raised. Many of us grow up in neighborhoods that people are typically like us. And so knowing that we're bringing these types of biases or experiences with us, the first thing for me is admitting that you likely have biases, period. I oftentimes am working with folks and they're like, I'm a good person, though. This has nothing to do with the fact that you're a good person. I hope that you strive to be a good person. But if you have been socialized, particularly I'm going to talk about the Western context of being in the United States. If you have been in the United States, you were raised here, you will likely have grown up with certain biases, whether you know it or not. And this could be around race, it could be around gender, it could be around social location, it could be around lookism, who do we deem as worthy and attractive, things like that. And so I think the first step is, in anything is saying, actually, I more than likely have biases, and how to uncover those, right? And how we are socialized. So, I like to look at different resources. There's this resource called the cycle of socialization that's out there, that you can look around, like, how have you been socialized within the society, and what things have you picked up along the way, whether that's in your schooling, if you've been involved in any type of religion or aspects of religion, whether that might mean how you grew up and your parents, what household you grew up in. All of those things and how we are socialized bring up biases. And so biases doesn't necessarily mean I'm a bad person. Biases means that we are all human and fallible, and the environments in which we grow up in inform who we are today. So for me, especially as a transmasculine person, especially as a person who has, I would say, grown up in understanding gender in very nuanced ways, I had to uncover a lot of biases, particularly as it relates to what does it mean for me now to be seen with this beard, to be seen as a man, to be seen in spaces where people are assuming that I'm cis or cisgender, and what biases come along with that, right? And so, I have to sit with those things and uncover those things. And honestly, all of this work that we're talking around in terms of biases comes around around thinking about our own mental health, thinking about how we're socialized, and really thinking about how do we uncover the things that we oftentimes think of as taboo. One of my favorite books that, I got early on was Why Do All the Black Kids Sit Together in the Cafeteria, by Beverly Tatum. And, one of the things that she talks about is the fact that, yes, from the moment that we begin working with our parents, that socialization happens, right? And oftentimes, depending upon your race, you have either been shamed into not talking about aspects around identity, or hyper, it's on the opposite end, and it from the beginning of time, if particularly as a Black person, if you've been socialized to talk about race very early on and not receiving that shame, right? So I think it's really important that, we have the honest conversation that we all have biases. And in order to uncover some of those, we have to do some deep work around how we've been socialized within our own homes, societies, and workplaces, schools, things like that.
Yes, beautifully said. I hope that people will replay that response, a couple times in the week to remember. Ask yourself, be honest. Because it's interesting how you mentioned that it is a mental thing that we need to work on. This is like, something that has been ingrained, whether we like it or not. And we need that, we need to support ourselves in that, and not just think that, oh, this means I'm a bad person. I'm a big fan of therapy, alternative therapy, any kind of therapy, dance there, whatever is your key to just unlocking some of that reality. So I really appreciate you highlighting this. Let's move on to this next question, because I think it could tie into what you just explained. So how do you handle and manage any backlash when your true authentic self is challenged?
I saw this and I was like, oh, wow, it depends on the context, right? So, a huge aspect around being authentic in the workplace is around psychological safety. And, I think that sometimes there's so many articles, so much research, so much conversation about what does it mean to be authentic in the workplace. And, while some of these come off as very self-help, I think one of the aspects that's really missing from the conversation is having a systems approach when it comes to this, right? So understanding that people are oftentimes dealing with different systems, whether that's racism, sexism, colorism, all the different isms, that genderism, all the different aspects that we might be dealing with in terms of discrimination and identity, right? And so, for me, authenticity and trying to combat that, I would say, is are you within an environment that is psychologically safe for you to do so, right? I never want people to be put in a situation where, you know, we have this approach of like, yeah, just be yourself, it's going to be okay. I don't know that. I don't know what it's like for your different work environments and how people might embrace authenticity within your own work environment. I think for me, you know, the first step around being authentic or trying to combat people who didn't want me to show up as my full self was doing it anyway and kind of being okay with the risk, right? And so, you know, I'll give I like talking about fashion a lot, particularly as a queer person, particularly as a person who believes that it disrupts our way of thinking about professionalism, around thinking about particularly how queer people show up in the workplace. And I was working at a pretty conservative, elite private university who has some strict rules and regulations around how one dresses. You know, and my way of combating that was wearing a satchel bag that was gifted to me. That, and I don't know if people, you know, have seen the show A Different World, but there is a character on there, Dwayne Wade, who was a professor on there, who wore a satchel bag when he would go into the classroom. One of my friends gifted me a satchel bag when I got this job because it was a huge opportunity for me, and that visibility was really important. I took a picture out in front of one of the famous buildings on the campus, and the next day my boss showed up with a laptop bag with the school's emblem on it, and was just like, people have an issue with how this bag looks in pictures. And for me, it was, some people would just say, just take the bag. That's how nice, thank you. But for me, it was just such a missed opportunity to understand the importance of this cultural aspect for me as a person who just received a doctorate, as somebody who could count the amount of Black people who were on staff, to hold this bag and to take this picture was really important and critical for me. I did not stop wearing that bag, you know, because it was important for me. And I got a lot of talking to as a result of that. There was no letter in my file or anything, but I had to be okay with being a little bit of countercultural when it came to that company and the policies around what they thought around professionalism, to be authentic for me. Because for me, my visibility was not just about myself, but for other Black trans people who might not have seen themselves in a similar position as myself. So that's a long answer, but I would say that, you know, really think about the risk, and really think about, you know, what are you willing to, as James Baldwin says, go broke for. You know, so it's a long answer, but that's some of the thoughts that I'm having right now.
Yes, and you dropped so much knowledge. I just want to let folks know that you will get a Rewatch email if you sign up for this chat, where Dr. Van Bailey will add links to these resources. Please drop in a couple of links of your favorite Different World episodes, because yes, filmmaking really helps, you know, change our perspective. So I love that it was able to influence you that way.
Yeah.
And actually, Amanda writes, I want to see that bag.
I have to try to find the picture that it, because it's, I feel like it's still on their website somewhere, and I'm like, haha. Just like I planned.
It wasn't a stock photo, because that's a whole other conversation we can talk about.
Okay.
Take the real photo of this is happening on campus. Okay, I digress. Alex writes, also sometimes having a safe place at work where you can be yourself, for example, ERG or team or whatever, can help lead into a larger comfort with being yourself in the larger company context, because you have a group who will support you. Do you want to speak to ERGs or?
Yeah, for sure. And I was going to mention ERGs later on in one of the other questions, but, you know, a huge aspect to being authentic and finding support for me was around, you know, I called it my peeps. finding folks in, my peeps started off with one other person. So I think sometimes people are like, my peeps has to be this large group of people. No, I just needed that one person that sometimes you need that person that you're in the meeting and you glance over to and you're like, and they're like, right? Or you can have lunch with, and so I think that, having employee resource groups, which are oftentimes sponsored by human resources or the folks who are working with different aspects of people and organizations on campus, or organizational, I've seen it come out of organizational development before. And they typically relate to different aspects of people's identity, right? So the ERGs that I've been a part of before, the LGBTQ plus group, I've been a part of Black staff ERGs, I've been a part of disability justice ERGs. So, and, some of those ERGs can be programmatic in nature, right? They might host panels, events, things like that, or simply they're just like, we're coming together to have lunch and to see people who look like me and have similar identity so we can find that support. I find ERGs to be extremely helpful. If your company or the place that you work don't have ERGs, sometimes folks have discussion boards or just different ways in which people can link over different topics of interest. That might be a way to go about doing it as well. But for me, I also try to find visible markers of people's queerness. So sometimes I'm looking for cues of flags in people's offices, if they have on pens, things like that. So that type of visual symbolism is, to me, oftentimes important when you have new employees or people who are trying to navigate. So to have those visual markers, I think, are important too. But it can't stop there.
Yeah, can't stop, won't stop. And actually, I would also ask for just because what I see now is, either you have a lot of lip service happening or you have just a lot of weight and burden put on an already full-time employee that then has to create an ERG that's a whole nother job that comes in and of itself. So how do you find that balance there? And actually, for folks who are listening, ERG, Employee Resource Group, I just want to make that clear because I know we had some people asking in the chat box. Apologies for just using the acronym and assuming that everyone knew. So Employee Resource Groups. Van, can you speak a little bit about just like the trouble that could happen if we don't show respect to people, to not essentially, I mean, this kind of leads into some questions that are happening in the chat box as well. Tokenism, like, all right, well, you're the queer person on the team. Show us what we need to know.
Yeah. So, an aspect of around being authentic is knowing what your limits are, right? And being honest with yourself around, your own sense of self-care, around your own sense of what really fuels you and makes you feel like you are getting good energy from your workplace, right? There are some folks who that does give them energy. They want to be engaged in their place of work. They don't mind being that person. I am an introvert, so I do not want to be that person oftentimes. And honestly, I get tokenized in a lot of different situations. So I'm typically not the person who's like me. So for me, I look to, trying to say this in a way that does not come off as harsh, but I feel like this work is the work of the company and is not necessarily the work of the employee who is in the marginalized position, right? So what that means is if you're in a position of power, and if anybody's on this call who's in a position of power and you don't have an employee resource group, I would say, why not? And figure out, the people who are in human resources or in organizational development to make that happen, and not to rely on the staff who are looking for those resources to make that happen. If you currently do not have anybody in human resources who's concerned about that, I am sure that there are people in your company who need that support, right? Just because you aren't asking doesn't mean that it's not needed, right? So I think it's really important to have data-driven data-driven support systems that are, for your company, as well as, for folks who are consistently being put in the tokenization position, knowing the power of no, and no is a complete sentence, right? Or ask a past employee asked me to do it, and I said, yeah, I'll do it, but I need a team to do it, right? It wasn't going to just be me. And so, what that meant for me is, one, to find this team, and then asking having a very real conversation around compensation and stipends, because emotional labor, tokenization, all of these things should be compensated. And if they are not, I would ask yourself, what other aspects of compensation are important to you? Professional development funds? Do you want flex time? Do you want opportunities to engage in other things, right? So I try to not always make aspects around money, but ways in which I can negotiate other aspects of my life around self-care, right? So you want me to do this ERG? Does that mean that I get a Friday off? Does that mean that, but like trying to negotiate ways in which I can okay, if this comes on my plate, then what comes off? Right. And having that very real conversation that this is actually extra labor. And I had to pull up, ERGs from other companies and showing that actually these are part of other people's full-time jobs. So you either are going to have to compensate me or hire somebody to do so, right? So I think it's really important to come with the data, to come with what your limitations are. If your limitations, you don't feel like doing it and you don't want to do it, that's okay, right? Provide your suggestions, find your people, and that is living authentically, and that's okay, right? You are not meant to quote unquote save your company, right? How can you actually make sure that you are well? That's by prioritizing what feels good for you first, right? And not necessarily the quote unquote company's needs.
Yes, I'm throwing digital confetti here. Lots of chatter in the chat box. I'm going to highlight.
Yeah, I see that people will volunteer you to probably lead that ERG. So, and that's where you have to come to the aspect of no, like if that's what you want to do or not, right? And that's kind of the reality of working with these companies. So, I'm not going to definitely paint the picture that it's going to be roses, and we're never going to be asked and we're never not going to be tokenized. And for me, that's knowing what my limits are and if I'm willing to do that, right? So if somebody says, yeah, you go ahead and create that, you can say, I have some solid suggestions for you, but I don't have the capacity for X, Y, and Z. How can I be helpful?
I love that. Yes. I love no is a complete sentence. I'm going to put that on a t-shirt or something and walk around with that. It's so true. No is a complete sentence. All right. So Lulu wrote earlier, how do you combat tokenism but still embrace being utilized as a resource, especially in the higher ed sphere? I think you've covered that, maybe not specifically for higher ed. So can you maybe add a little flavor to tackle that question?
Yeah, higher ed loves a token. And so I think, for me, trying to combat the tokenization is, once again, knowing what your limitations are, right? So I'm knowing what for you is resource and what for you is tokenization, right? So I'm able to do X, Y, and Z, and I am not available to do X, Y, and Z, and sticking to that, right? And knowing that and when I have done that, and I'm saying all of these things in saying that doesn't mean that there won't be risks that happen, right? Because when you set boundaries and you set limits, there are oftentimes reactions. Some people will say that you're not a team player. There might be people who might say, and all of these aspects are around respectability. All of these aspects are around these notions of professionalism, which typically upheld, one type of aspect around being, right, which is to be white, to be cis, to be male, right, in these spaces, able-bodied, so forth. And so for me, tokenization meant that in higher education, oftentimes it means that it's committee work, leading committee work, starting committees, being in the perpetual cycle of committees, having to galvanize other people who are like you. I had to learn that just because I don't do it doesn't mean it's not going to happen. to, or and if it doesn't happen right now, that's not my burden to hold, right? And so, I would say in higher education, you have to have strong boundaries. And being able to stick to those boundaries is really challenging, especially if your values don't necessarily align with your supervisors or your companies or your universities. So, I would say all of this to say, be prepared for any type of backlash or any misalignment when it comes to boundary setting, particularly in higher education, because I don't think that we have the best boundaries in this industry. So, and that's just speaking facts, which I like to do in these type of conversations.
Ooh, dropping so much knowledge. Lulu, thank you for dropping that. I guess we answered your question there. I just want to hold for a light pause to practice some emotional intelligence here. If anyone wants to hop off mute and voice a question or reflection, I'm going to hold for a light pause and please take this opportunity to hop off mute. If not, I got some more questions, don't worry, but I want to share the space. All right, let's roll into this next question. Maybe that will get some minds churning here. So coming out as non-binary after 50, I'm finding it hard to be taken seriously. I work for a nonprofit of 120 plus employees as an LGBTQIA plus advocate for domestic and sexual violence. Our HR department consists of one part-time person. Microaggressions are rampant and culturally acceptable. What ideas do you have that can help people in similar situations navigate a work environment that is caustic while still being one's authentic self?
One, I just want to sit with that. That's the environment that you're in right now and how that might feel very heavy for you. So thank you for sharing your lived experience. And, I could approach it from a policy standpoint. So, in terms of what is the non-discrimination policy on for your company? And does the non-discrimination policy cover gender identity and expression? And if that's the aspect, then we're dealing directly with HR, right? Which I've had to do before and had to actually uphold people, to actually saying, this is actually an HR issue. You not respecting my pronouns, you not respecting my identity. And if you have this in your non-discrimination policy and the practice is otherwise, that's an issue, right? And for me, because I work in bias and support services, it's like, if there's no trainings, if there is no education that's happening, that might be a suggestion that for HR to make sure that happens, particularly as it relates to managers and other, because that's typically where HR starts. They typically start with the C-suite and then managers and supervisors is, understanding how does bias show up, particularly as it relates to gender identity and expression, right? And if there's no education that's currently happening that your company is involved in, people might not even have the language for microaggressions, right? So I think it's really important from a human resource standpoint that people are able to know what their rights are, to know what the policies and protocols are, and to know that typically those rights and protocols protect you. And oftentimes we're afraid to flex that because of the potential backlash. So I would say that. Now, I would say that most times human resources has caused harm as well as to individuals, particularly who might relate to who are LGBTQ plus. So there might be some hesitation around working with human resources, right? So, for me, when I've had that situation come up, I've tried to find my coalition of peeps and to figure out what do we need to do to either work with the willing in addressing some of these cultural aspects in our company that might be making us uncomfortable? What are the intersections in which other people might be experiencing other other microaggressions, right? So oftentimes people want to talk about identity in a vacuum, and not talk about our whole selves and the whole person. And I think it's important to have a multifaceted approach when coming to things around bias, right? So I think, not just approaching it from the gender identity aspect, but what other aspects of identity might other people might be experiencing microaggressions, and how do we approach this from an intersectional perspective rather than a kind of a one-off in terms of identities, right? And so, that's kind of where I would start. But, the sustainability practices of showing up as your authentic self really I don't look for the workplace to do that for me. I think, that was one of the heartbreaking lessons for me, right? And being in a field for 15 years and constantly looking to my employer to do work that honestly I probably should have been doing with my own therapist, and doing with my own self around being comfortable with who I am, despite the environment that I was in. Asking hard questions around, is this a company that I should be aligned with? These are all really hard questions to ask ourselves that might cause us to either shift. I'm back in school getting an MSW, to either shift careers, thoughts, mindsets, right? I've been at several institutions because for me, alignment is very important as it relates to values. And as soon as I start feeling misalignment and undervalued, I have to start looking for somewhere else to be. And that's just kind of a harsh not a harsh reality, but just a reality of kind of trying to figure out that alignment as it relates to your own values and where you feel like you might thrive as an employee. What's important for you? And authenticity varies, right? Is authenticity for me is making sure that y'all are not going to have my quote unquote legal name all up and through things, right? That you're going to respect my chosen name, right? And that might be enough for me. Other people might need other things as it relates to what feels authentic for them in the workplace. So, yeah.
Thank you so much for diving deep there. I'm just going to highlight some things that are coming up in the chat box. So Alex writes, as someone who started their transition after 40, totally feel this, you rock. Amanda writes, this person, my heart goes out to them. So if you're listening on the call, we really appreciate you submitting this question because clearly you're not alone. Okay, so Elsie writes, I don't get why some companies do not take HR seriously and have minimal to zero HR personnel. Amy writes, because HR supports the established systems, not the people. My experience says they treat people like servants, children, or robots. +1 to Amy there. Megan writes, I was going to say HR in my experience has always defended whoever I reported rather than the individual reporting. Vanessa wants to elaborate on how HR can cause harm. So I think maybe some of those above explained that. Alex writes, my experience with HR causing harm is denying an identity exists or letting you know that your coworkers are uncomfortable working with you because of your identity. Christina's here. This was my question. Thank you for being here. I very much appreciate this answer. My ED and HR said, well, we hired you as a she, so that is how we will know you. I am the LGBTQ coordinator there. I am currently looking for a new place to work. So I see how HR is harmful. Dr. Bailey, Can you respond to any of these reflections?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, one of the things that, a lot of the readings and research around authenticity talks about the need to not have a one-size-fits-all approach to your employees. And that is kind of the description of human resources, right? Like, how do we figure out what policies and procedures that everybody needs to follow, one size fits all for this entire company, right? Not understanding the multiple nuances of identity and how people might have to navigate those things depending upon how identity shifts, right? So what that sounds like is that your employer has no idea around how identity actually works, particular gender identity, particularly gender expression when it comes to it being on a spectrum. So to say, hey, we hired you as this, this is how we're going to do it, is actually wrong, right? And that's a period. And so I think, it sounds like they're very misinformed around aspects of identity, and they might need to have some education themselves. So, which to me, this is what makes HR sometimes really harmful, when when people who are not educated and do not have just knowledge around how identity works, and then they're creating policies and creating procedures and ways of being for companies, and they don't know who actually works for them. And that's, to me, the misalignment around wanting people to show up authentically and then having approaches that don't allow people to do that. So that's, to me, a terrible misalignment.
So Christine is here. They are clearly not alone, and I really appreciate you for writing this question, and just to get our minds thinking of how we can realign so that we can include everyone's voices. I mean, actually, Van, I would love to hear from you, because I guess, it's been a hot topic to make space at the table. I am under the belief that don't make space at the table. Let's just create a new table. Because clearly, I know that's very controversial, but I think that some of the things that are being written in the chat box kind of show that HR is supposed to defend the people, but they clearly, not all, of course, sometimes, out of fear or out of who knows what, out of tradition. I mean, so many things we can throw up in the air on that. They defer to protecting the people that can basically keep them employed or something like that. I would love to just transition to this question here, speaking of interviews. So how we can kind of be ahead of like having our antennas up to know that, this might not be the safest place for us to apply and to continue to work, especially as I see folks are transitioning, like Christine wrote there. So this question reads, how do you bring up the subject of security in the interview stage to know if the culture is conducive to being out?
Yeah, so these are questions that I ask in my interview process, pretty directly. And it depends on how, one, are you willing to kind of out yourself in that moment in the interview process? Or if you can do some behind the scenes work in terms of, one of the things that I like to do is ask people around their insurance policies. And the reason I ask about insurance policies, particularly as a trans person, is most times that they don't know. That tells me a lot about the company, right? So I'll give an example. I was getting recruited hard for a job in Virginia. They really wanted me to take the job. I was like, great. I have some questions. I see that in your non-discrimination policy, these are the aspects that are protected. Could you tell me a little bit more about your insurance policy as it relates to trans individuals? The person told me they didn't know. Red flag. So for me, I was like, y'all are recruiting a trans person real hard, real heavy, but you can't tell me anything about the insurance policy. Okay, fine. You don't know. Great. So I'll as a manager, you don't know. So I'm going to go directly and ask benefits. They also did not know, right? And then when I dug a little bit more, I found that they actually had trans exemptions when it came to their insurance policy. So for me, it was once again, I'm going back to this alignment piece. It was a terrible misalignment for people to be so gung-ho to want to bring in this diversity, but they, on the other end, their policies and procedures could not support them. So, sometimes it's about digging in terms of the policies and procedures. I use LinkedIn to see what people are from their company are posting. I look to see what aspects of education that they're putting out there, particularly on their LinkedIn or in their company. Are they only doing Pride during June? Do they only have the rainbow flag up during June? Like just different things like that, that help me signal if this is a company that is beyond symbolism and is actually in the practice of what they're doing. I look to see aspects of how authentic people are in their bios on LinkedIn, right? If people talk about being out, if people are talking about or sharing articles of those things, like those kind of things are important to me, because at least that makes me feel like maybe the conversation is not happening in your company, but you feel comfortable enough of doing this on a professional platform that where other people are seeing you, that your company is aware of you, y'all are linked together. So I would definitely kind of do the behind the scenes work. And, if you do have any personal connections in the companies, making sure that you have conversations with people who work there, and not being afraid to reach out to people and asking what their experience has been, so those are some things that, I would do.
Yes. And to remember, when we apply for jobs, to look at it as a partnership, because we're giving our time, our energy, our talent, our ideas. And so we want to make sure that we're being taken care of. So don't be afraid to ask those hard questions. And if you see a red flag or an antenna goes up, of course, we need to pay the bills. We need to make sure that we have, everything taken care of on a financial realm. But again, your safety is key. So I just will echo that. And Ben, thank you so much for highlighting that.
Yeah, you're interviewing them too, right?
Mm-hmm.
It is definitely a reciprocal process.
Mm-hmm.
And you are worthy of getting those answers, those questions answered.
Absolutely. Speaking of questions answered, we got about 6 minutes left. So
okay.
I'm gonna hold for another pause. Someone want to hop off mute now? Voice of reflection question. Now is your time to shine. Don't be scared. All right. So Ben has dropped a lot of knowledge, and we've got about 5 minutes left. So don't worry, he's still going to be dropping knowledge. But I just want to let everyone know you will get a Rewatch email if you sign up for this chat with links to resources and things like that. Can you remind us how we can get in touch with you when we end this conversation, so that if people have questions that might come up, after taking a nap or going for a walk, they can reach out to you?
Yeah, for sure. So it's Dr. Van Bailey on LinkedIn, drvanbailey.com. If for folks who want to go to my website, very accessible via website and also very accessible via LinkedIn.
Beautiful. I'm also going to drop my connections as well in the chat box here. Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. Let's see, since we've got about 4 minutes left, I just want to give you the final word. Van, let us know, food for thought. You've covered a lot of points. We didn't even get to all the questions, so I hope we can have you back and we can dive into those questions. But food for thought, what do you want to leave us with? What can we do starting now? And then again, just remind us how we can connect with you when you finish wrapping us up there.
Yeah, so while I'm typing my information in here, thank you, EC. Really appreciate you. EC is also somebody who has worked on my website, so shout out to EC for all branding things. So, I think it's when we're talking about authenticity, I want us to come back to ourselves and to center ourselves and our needs. And who we are in this conversation. A lot of the questions, and I think that they are definitely questions around angst and nervousness, and rightfully so when it comes to companies or the places in which we work. And, we should definitely have aspects of focus on that. But I want the focus to go back on ourselves. And what does it mean for care? What does it mean around self-love and worthiness? To know that you all are worthy of care and to be worthy of being seen and respected, and to be healthy in your work environments. You're worthy of those things, right? And so to any way in which that I can be supportive to you all in those environments, please reach out to me. But know that there are going to be You know, when we're talking about HR, when we're talking about these companies, we're talking about power. We're talking about sometimes situations in which we feel very powerless. But in order to take some of that power back, we really have to begin to center ourselves again, to know that you're worthy of the care, worthy of being seen as your full and whole selves. And I hope that if you're not in an environment now that allows you to do so, that you find one that will. So thank you.
Yes, thank you. I love that you could set the stage for us in the beginning of this conversation with just, how can we identify confidently, be our authentic selves? And now, coming full circle, pointing the arrow back to us and making sure that we have that self-reflection, that self-awareness component, and then bring to a team or to a company instead of expecting them to have everything together. Because we're talking generations of this kind of system being built. And, I really am grateful for the people who are on the call right now, people who are listening in, because that shows that you are curious and you have the desire to dismantle. I love speaking about decolonizing the mind. And this is how we could do it, right? Reshaping the way that we respect each other, we respect ourselves. I've learned a lot in this conversation. Dr. Van Bailey, thank you so much for sharing. I'm definitely going to be connecting with you when we finish this conversation. And I extend the invitation to all of our live callers and those who are rewatching this video to reach out, ask questions, form alliances, and support each other with love and grace. Until then, we'll see you on the next chat. I love all of the engagement in the chat box. Bring these conversations to your table. I don't think that this is off limits anymore. Actually, I think now we have an expectation to bring this up, if we are in the safe space to do that. So you have our encouragement. Dr. Van Bailey, we really appreciate you dropping knowledge today. Take care of yourselves, everyone. And I'll leave you with the final word.
Oh, me?
Yep, I love that. I want you to know, and that's a sentence, but I'll leave you with the final
that's
word.
Right. Y'all take good care.
All right, everyone. See you. Bye.